At 20,000 feet above Nazi-occupied Europe, two American B-17 bombers slammed into each other at full speed. Metal tore, wings shattered, engines exploded. Both planes should have fallen from the sky in pieces, but instead, they locked together, one bomber's nose buried inside the other's tail. Two aircraft, two crews, one impossible flying machine, and for several terrifying minutes, they stayed in the air, flying as a single, broken monster no engineer ever designed. This is the true World War II story of the day physics blinked. Survival defied logic, and two B-17s flew together as one plane. Part 1. The Flying Fortress. By 1943, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had become the backbone of America's daylight bombing campaign. It was massive. 4 roaring engines, brutal defensive firepower, with 13 machine guns, thick aluminum skin, and crews trained to fight fires. Bleed and fly home half destroyed, the B-17 earned a reputation for surviving the impossible. Pilots told stories of fortresses landing with entire tails missing, engines shot clean off, holes so large a man could crawl through them. But no story, none, compared to what happened over Germany on one cold winter morning. The mission. January 1944. Hundreds of B-17s lifted off from airfields in England, forming massive combat boxes that stretched for miles. Their target, deep inside Germany, factories fueling Hitler's war machine. Among them were 2 bombers flying in the same formation. B-17 No. 1, piloted by First Lieutenant Charles Chuck Schmidt. B-17 No. 2, piloted by Second Lieutenant Edward Ed Rogers. Both crews were young. Most were barely in their 20s. They knew the risks. German flak, Messerschmitt fighters, mid-air collisions inside tight formations. But nobody imagined what fate had prepared for them. Hell in the sky. As the bombers crossed into enemy airspace, the sky turned violent. Black flak bursts exploded like iron flowers. Shrapnel slammed into wings. Engines coughed smoke. Formations tightened instinctively, because staying together meant survival. Then it happened. A sudden flak burst rocked Schmidt's B-17. The plane lurched violently. At the same moment, Rogers' bomber drifted slightly upward, just inches too far. At nearly 300 miles per hour, there was no time to react. The collision. The impact was catastrophic. Schmidt's bomber slammed directly into the rear of Rogers' aircraft. Metal screamed. The nose of Schmidt's B-17 smashed into the tail section of Rogers' plane, slicing through the stabilizers and elevators. Both aircraft spun wildly. Crewmen were thrown against walls. Equipment tore loose. Fuel lines ruptured. Everyone expected the same outcome. A total breakup. A fireball. On death spiral to the ground. But instead, the planes locked together. One impossible aircraft. Against all logic, Schmidt's bomber did not fall away. Its cockpit was jammed into the other plane's tail like a puzzle piece. The wreckage formed a single, twisted structure. 2 planes fused mid-air. Amazingly, the combined mass stabilized. The engines on Rogers' aircraft were still producing power. The wings, damaged but intact, generated enough lift. They were still flying. Inside both planes, stunned crews stared in disbelief. They were alive, and somehow, they were airborne. Panic and decisions. Inside Schmidt's cockpit, the controls were dead. The elevators were gone. The rudder was destroyed. They could not steer. In Rogers' bomber, the tail controls were crushed by Schmidt's nose. Neither pilot truly had control, but Rogers realized something terrifying. Schmidt's bomber was acting like extra ballast and an anchor. If they stayed together too long, they would eventually lose lift and crash. There was only one possible chance to survive. The crews had to bail out. The jump. Over enemy territory, bailing out meant capture, or worse. But staying meant certain death. Schmidt ordered his crew to jump. One by one, men climbed toward the exits, staring at the surreal sight of another bomber fused into theirs. Parachutes opened in the frozen air. German soldiers would later report seeing something unbelievable. 2 bombers flying as one. Then men falling from the sky. Rogers' crew followed. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers below the wreckage. Miraculously, most of the men survived the jump. The ghost flight. Now unmanned, the fused bombers continued flying. No pilots, no crew, no human control, just engines, gravity, and broken aerodynamics. For several more minutes, the 2 B-17s drifted together. A silent, terrifying ghost aircraft. German fighter pilots later reported seeing it. Some refused to fire, believing it was already doomed. Eventually, physics reclaimed its authority. The combined plane began to descend. Slowly, gracefully, inevitably. The final crash. The fused bombers finally lost lift and crashed into a German field. The impact destroyed what remained of both aircraft, but the impossible had already happened. They had flown, together, long enough to save lives. Aftermath. Out of 20 airmen, most survived. Some became prisoners of war. Some were wounded. All were forever changed. When Allied intelligence debriefed the survivors, officers initially did not believe the story. 2 B-17s stuck together. Flying? It sounded impossible, until reconnaissance photos and German reports confirmed it. Engineers later studied the incident and concluded, the lower bomber acted as a stabilizer, and the upper bomber provided lift. Engine thrust compensated for drag. It was a 1 in a million aerodynamic accident. Why this story matters. World War II is full of massive battles and famous generals, but this story reminds us of something deeper. War is fought by ordinary people, trapped in extraordinary moments. Young men, terrified and unprepared, forced to make impossible decisions in seconds. That day, survival wasn't achieved by skill alone. It was achieved by sheer chance, courage, and the stubborn refusal of 2 broken machines to fall. The collision itself lasted less than 2 seconds, but for the men inside both bombers it felt endless. When Schmidt's B-17 slammed into Rogers' aircraft, the shockwave ripped through the fuselage like a thunderclap. Gunners were thrown from their seats. Navigation tables snapped loose. Oxygen masks ripped away. One crewman later said, "It felt like the sky punched us." In Schmidt's plane, the cockpit glass shattered inward. The nose gunner was killed instantly, crushed between twisted steel and exploding instruments. The rest of the crew screamed, believing the next moment would be their last. Yet the expected freefall never came. The moment they realized they were still flying. Seconds passed, then more seconds. The floor did not tilt downward. Their stomachs did not lift. The engines were still roaring. Schmidt looked at his altimeter. They were still above 18,000 feet. That's when the impossible truth hit them. They weren't falling. Somewhere behind them, another plane was holding them up. In Rogers' aircraft, the tail gunner, or what was left of his position, stared forward in disbelief. Where the tail should have been, there was another bomber. 2 cockpits, 2 nightmares. Both pilots fought their controls. Nothing responded normally. Schmidt's control column moved freely, too freely. The elevators were gone. The rudder had been ripped away. Rogers still had partial throttle control, but steering felt sluggish and unpredictable. It was like flying with a dead weight attached, because that's exactly what it was. 2 B-17s together weighed over 60 tons. Every second they stayed aloft was borrowed time. The terrifying silence on the radio. Normally, bomber crews were surrounded by radio chatter. On this day, there was none. The formation had moved on. Fighter escorts were gone. Enemy territory stretched endlessly below. Rogers tried to transmit. Mayday, mayday. 2 aircraft collided. Still flying. Static. Even if someone heard them, no one could help. No pilot in history had trained for this situation. There was no checklist titled, "What to do when you're fused to another plane." The decision that saved lives. Schmidt knew something crucial. If the planes separated violently, they would tumble. But if they stayed together too long, drag and fuel loss would kill them anyway. There was only one option that gave the crew a chance. He turned to his men and shouted over the noise, "Grab your chutes. We're getting out." Some froze. Bailing out at 20,000 feet meant extreme cold, low oxygen, enemy capture. But no one argued. They trusted their pilot. And they trusted gravity more than twisted aluminum. The most unreal evacuation of the war. Men climbed toward exits that were half destroyed. Some had to crawl past exposed wiring and shredded metal. One airman paused at the hatch and looked back. Behind him, through torn bulkheads, he could see the cockpit of another aircraft, another crew, staring back. 2 groups of strangers connected by disaster. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They jumped, falling through history. As parachutes deployed, the roar of engines faded. The sky became eerily quiet. Below them, forests, frozen fields, enemy roads. German soldiers looked up confused. First, they saw something unbelievable. 2 American bombers flying as one. Then men began falling from it. Later, German officers would describe the scene as a miracle. or madness, capture and survival. Most of the airmen were captured within hours. They were cold, injured, and shaken, but alive. When interrogated, they told their story. German officers laughed, then accused them of lying. 2 planes stuck together? Flying? Impossible. Until German pilots and ground observers confirmed it. Only then did disbelief turn into stunned silence. The unmanned monster. Back in the sky, the fused bombers flew on without human hands. Engines eventually lost synchronization. Fuel burned unevenly. The aircraft began a slow, wide descent, almost peaceful. No explosions, no flames, just gravity reclaiming what it was owed. When the wreckage finally hit the ground, it left a scar in the earth and a mystery in the air. Allied shock. After the war, Allied investigators reconstructed the event. They ran calculations. They tested models. Their conclusions stunned even engineers. And the upper B-17's wings still produced lift, and the lower aircraft acted like a stabilizing fin. The engine thrust barely overcame drag. Remove or change any single factor, and everyone dies. It was aerodynamics balanced on a knife edge. Why it never happened again. Despite thousands of bomber missions, this never happened again. Because formations changed, spacing improved, altitudes varied, and because luck like this doesn't repeat itself. It was a once-in-history collision between physics and fate. The human side. Years later, survivors reunited, older, quieter, still haunted. One said, "I survived flak fighters and fire. But that day, the sky decided to spare us. They never called it skill. They called it mercy." At 20,000 feet, logic failed. 2 bombers collided, and should have died. Instead, metal held, engines roared, and gravity waited. For a few impossible minutes, the sky carried a secret. A flying wreck held together by chance, courage, and broken wings. Most wars are remembered by victories and defeats, but this moment was remembered because it should not exist. 2 B-17s, 1 sky, 1 miracle. And the silence that followed proved one thing. Sometimes, even in war, the sky refuses to let go.